Welcome back to my channel. It's good to see you again, and today I want to talk about a really interesting and important subject, which is what are your options for doing SQL Server on Azure? And most of the time when people are considering this, it's because they're considering migrating on-premises SQL workloads to Azure. There's a lot to talk about. It's really interesting and it's riveting, so let's jump in. My name is Brian Cafferkey and I am a Data and AI Solutions Enabler. Now, before we get into this, I do want to provide some background because I don't like to assume people know things. I know I get confused a lot, so just in case you do too, I'll go over a few things. When you get into the cloud, there are three basic types of architecture. Now they're adding a bunch more, but these were the three I learned, I was groomed on. And the first is infrastructure as a service. Now, this is really where the cloud came from because people are already doing this on their premises. They were creating virtual machines and virtual resources as a way to get more flexibility. So they kind of had their own little cloud going on already. Now they call it private cloud, but that's what it is. So I always think of that more as like hardware. Hardware as a service or hardware in the cloud, because you're creating things like machines, things that are really software versions of physical things like VNets and network cards and virtual machines. So that's the basic place where everything came from. But then think of something like Office 365 and Power BI, and you have something at the sort of other end of the spectrum, which is called software as a service. Now the difference here is, whereas IaaS, infrastructure as a service, you're really creating everything, and you have to know all the configurations. You're going to select the hardware under the covers you need, etc. Software as a service is something you just use, right? If you use Office, you don't think about any cloud resources it's using. Power BI, you do think a little about it, but only in terms of how you're using it. So it's just, you just go in and use it. It's the easiest to use on the cloud altogether. If you use even Outlook Mail, you're using that. Platform as a service is an interesting one. I believe it offers the most value to customers who use the cloud like Azure. And so I want to talk about that. And in particular, platform as a service is offering what it says. It's offering some sort of application tier service. So there are PaaS services which are specifically targeted towards the applications, but the ones we're talking about here are ones that provide SQL Server Database services. So those are the three types of services, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that. So as I said, SQL Server on Azure falls there. And the most important thing I think to bear in mind is that the level of work it takes on the part of you, the customer, is whether it's IaaS is the most work with the greatest flexibility. You can do whatever you want, but it's a lot of work. And that's pretty much, with IaaS, you're getting very closely what you would have on premises, with the exception of infinite resources in a cloud environment like Azure. And SaaS is the least work, and then in the middle of the sandwich here is PaaS, which is you're trying to get the benefits of having it do a lot of the work for you, but still have enough control that you can get what you need specifically from it. Drinking my mug today. I'm not at my usual location. I'm home, so I don't have my usual assortment of technical nerd mugs, but I got this one anyway. So let's talk about the ways to do SQL Server. So the easiest way is, if you've got on-premises SQL Server, you can migrate those to SQL Server virtual machines, and for the most part there shouldn't be much differences, except that in Azure you're going to have to figure out what are the SKUs, what type of VM is going to closely match what you've had on premises, but you'll have the full functionality. You're actually installing SQL Server on a virtual machine. Now the nice thing is, of course, there's pre-cataloged packages you can pick in the marketplace that will automatically create the kind of version, etc. you want, but that's the first. You can always do that, but you can also use a PaaS offering called SQL Managed Instance. Managed Instance does a lot of things like backup recovery, has always on, it has SLAs associated. So with Managed Instance, it's a lot less work for users to actually maintain it. DBAs have a lot less to worry about. A lot of security features and things are enabled. It's kind of a wrapper around SQL Server, and you're always up to latest releases and patches and things. You don't have to worry about security patches. So Azure Managed Instance is a good offering, but we're going to have to talk about whether or not it's for you. And finally, the oldest PaaS offering, older than Managed Instance, is called Azure SQL Database. It's a lot less robust than Managed Instance, but it has a lot more ease of use features. So let's jump in a little more and figure out what makes sense. So think about what you're trying to do and what you want to move to the cloud, and this will hopefully tie into it. So there are two basic SQL Server workloads. There's the left, which is called OLTP or transactional workloads, and there's the right, which is your business intelligence, reporting, query, analysis kind of workloads. Okay. OLTP, in a nutshell, is what the DBAs worry about. It's the things that makes them lose sleep. That's what they usually are talking about. Whenever I go to a SQL Pass meetings or conferences, they're almost always speaking about performance tuning and things on OLTP. Rarely do they talk about the BI side. There's reasons for that, which I'll explain. OLTP databases, online transactional processing, is focused on transactions, which means updates, inserts, adds, deletes. It's all about throughput, and that's because OLTP transactions are focused on the core business. So core business, I mean order entry. So if you, Amazon's very large, but if you think of Amazon, people go in and they insert and they're making orders. That's the business. Every time somebody adds something to their cart and checks out, the company makes money, right? That would be an OLTP situation. Many companies have those kinds of things, client-facing, customer-facing things where people order things, and that's really critical because that's money. Not surprisingly, with OLTP, you want them to always be running. You want zero downtime. The reality is there's always going to be some level of downtime, even if it wasn't intended. The system may crash for some reason, or there may be a problem. But the idea is always to have always on. In fact, I use that term always on because that's a feature in SQL Server so that you can set it up so that you never have to bring the servers down. Any downtime costs money, and in many cases a lot of money. Stability, not surprisingly, and resilience is crucial because you don't want that lost money. And executives at the C-suite are going to get very excited when there's a downtime in these databases. Also, security is critical because typically OLTP databases are customer facing, they're externally facing. If you think about websites, very often that would be an OLTP behind it, supporting some sort of ordering system. That's anybody could go to that, try to hack into that website and get to the database. And these typically systems, OLTP, are going to probably store credit card information, personal information about customers and people, possibly even social security numbers, depending on the type of system. Like healthcare would probably have social security numbers. Really critical stuff, and if it got hacked, could really be the downfall of the business. So again, security is critical. And another piece that you can't overlook is OLTP databases are oftentimes really heavy workloads. They're often a single server because SQL Server, until 2019 anyway, is designed as a single server typically, with always on using other servers. So the idea is it's very beefed up servers, and I have seen companies that are pushing SQL Server to the very limit. Enterprise SQL Server with many core, a lot of memory, and they're just banging against the limits of what it can support. So that heavy workload combined with stability is a tricky thing because you have this, you're burning the drive. Sometimes you can almost see the lights dimming in the company because they're burning so much resources to run the OLTP database, and SQL Server is pushed to the limits and tuned to perfection, and they're still hitting this wall almost. So that's important, and it's challenging. So typically there's a sense among DBAs, I think, and I would be the same way, is it's working, we've got it right, everything's, it's humming along. And let's face it, if it doesn't, people can lose jobs. This is a lot of money at stake. So there's a real risk in moving OLTP workloads to Azure, and we have to look at that. On the other side is a little bit lighter. Business intelligence, the fun stuff, right? Business intelligence is all about retrieving data and supporting reporting requirements and that kind of thing. Crucial thing in terms of design, it is not designed for optimal updates and inserts, and in fact, it doesn't. If it's designed properly, it's not following the rules of normalization. In fact, it is following something called dimensional modeling. And if it's a dimensionally modeled warehouse, look at my video on dimensional modeling and analysis services, and you'll see the differences that go on in reporting. It's a different mindset. DBAs rarely think in that mindset because they're focused on the OLTP side, but business intelligence is an inverse of that because it's designed to get data quickly. People usually don't freak out if the business intelligence system is down for a few minutes or even a couple of hours. They don't like it, but rarely in a company do people at the C-suite start getting upset. In fact, rarely is the people in the C-suite even aware. Unavailability is costly, but only in the long term, because reporting systems are designed more in terms of strategy and strategic information and then making decisions. So if it's a few hours or even a day or two, it's not really going to knock the company down or cost money. But in the long term, it does have an effect. But the OLTP is immediate. Pain is immediate. Stability and resilience, because of these other features, is less critical. Yes, you want it, but I have not seen a reporting system yet that had always on availability and all these core things. So I don't think it's generally as critical. And security is an interesting thing. You're going to have a lot of different services, a lot of different people going into this databases, the database instance, I'll call it, because you have many databases. And you have a lot of options in terms of security. Now, one option you have that few people take is that you could simply not include personal information in many cases. You don't necessarily need credit card numbers. Why would you need that when you're doing aggregation, reporting, and visualizations? Probably don't. You may not even need person's names, and certainly not things like social security number. So one of your options is simply to eliminate data that's risky to keep. Why keep it if you don't need to? Why replicate? Because this data is always a replication of somewhere else. It's not where the data originates. So you have to really think about security options, and in a different way. Speed is less critical. Now again, imagine on the left, a customer is waiting to place an order. They sat 30 seconds on your website and it still hasn't come back. I give it 10 seconds on Amazon before I close the window. You lose money. On the right, it's somebody who works for the company typically, and if they have to wait 30 seconds, they usually just wait. Typically, they're probably not running through a web server either. They're probably running something like a Power BI report, and shame on you, Power BI developer. You should have used analysis services. See my other videos. But you can wait a few seconds in some cases. They complain, and there's more time to react if they do complain, but speed is a little less critical. And again, many tools are used. So think of it in terms of when I walk through your options to migrate workloads to Azure for SQL Server, you have to kind of split out this mindset. What type of workload are you using? Now, from a risk standpoint, I always found when I worked at Microsoft, it was easier to promote the business intelligence workloads because of these less fear factors going on, especially with DBAs. But the reality is, there's better support for the OLTP workloads, and I'll explain why. Again, so OLTP, if that goes down, you look like the person on the left. And business intelligence, you look like the person on the right. You're upset, you're worried, you're working diligently to solve it, but it's not 2 in the morning, because they wouldn't call you about a business intelligence problem at 2 in the morning usually. It's probably like, noontime, or maybe just got into work and you start working away. You probably won't even skip lunch for that problem. Anyway, let's move forward. So let's talk about SQL Server Azure Migration. And the question I really want you to think about here is, can you go to PaaS? That is going to give you the maximum value. You don't have to worry about all these grudgy details. Now, I just want to get in and work, so I'm not a DBA. So I like things just to work. And it's really great for workloads. I'll throw this in as a side, but if you don't have for development, testing, etc., DBAs, this is a great way to just offload that stuff that you don't need to worry about. Just go there with it, because then you can focus on what you really worry about. But in any migration to Azure, consider, can you use PaaS? And only if you can't, then I would say use the VMs, because you really lose a lot. You're not getting the true benefit of the cloud. In fact, I even went to Microsoft because I was so excited about PaaS offerings, not just SQL Server, but things like Databricks and Spark and HD Insight and Azure Data Warehouse, now Synapse. That fascinated me. So let's step forward. Now I'm going to step back for a minute. This is something I have never seen anyone else talk about, and it's a problem because you need to understand this to understand migration. SQL Server is not a single thing. If you use Postgres, it's a single thing. You got a database, you update things, you store data. And Oracle has a bunch of different products they sell. SQL Server is a stack. The original thing it came from, which was originally Sybase, is database services. So that's your T-SQL. It has a job scheduler called SQL Agent. It has things called link service to connect to other things. It has integrated Active Directory. It supports high availability encryption. That's your core database, but there's a lot more. In around 2005, that's the time I believe it came out, SQL Server 2005 added something called integration services. This is a really powerful first-class ETL, extract, transform, load solution. It's basically a massive extract, transform, and load solution, sort of a big data mover with lots of things you can do. It is typically heavily used in your data warehouse, your business intelligence SQL Server implementations, probably a lot less likely to be used in your OLTP instances. Database services is heavily used in both workloads. But integration services, that's where you're going to pull data in, massage it, turn it around, clean it up, and then maybe load it into a warehouse. Okay, another service they added is something called SSRS, reporting services. SSRS is a precursor really to Power BI. It is more of your legacy kind of reporting in your mindset, I guess you'd say. It's more, think of rows and columns with subtotals and things. And I tend to think of it as more operational type reporting. It doesn't or didn't originally have like a lot available in terms of visualizations. It has got a lot of nice features though, like the ability to extract data, the ability to schedule reports to run at certain times and even email them to people. So some pretty cool stuff. So SSRS is there. Now I will say this, there is now something called Power BI Report Server, and so if you want Power BI functionality with SSRS, then you would use Power BI Report Server, which allows the analytics functionality of Power BI and the reporting functionality that you had with reporting services, which they now term pixel perfect reporting. So if you see pixel perfect, they're talking about SSRS reports. Finally, not finally yet, but analysis services. So if you do Power BI, you may not be aware that Power BI is actually an extraction of a prior set of tools that were part of Excel. So there was Power Pivot, Power Map, Power Query, Power View, all these different things. And those tools were just add-ins to Excel. I believe they're still available and you can still use them, and I think they're all free. But what happened at one point was Microsoft decided they wanted to pull them all together and create a separate product, and that became Power BI. Now it's important because when you had that previous product, a product also, a service in SQL Server came out called Analysis Services. Now I have a video on that also. If I can remember, I'll put that at the end with links on Analysis Services, why you need it, etc. But originally, the first sort of slice and dice service, which goes back over 10 years, was called the multi-dimensional model. And it had to actually pre-aggregate all the data and do all these things. Now that MDX, a multi-dimensional model, is actually something that Tableau and ClickView, I think, and a bunch of other products can support because it does go back a long way. And those multi-dimensional models were really popular. A lot of companies have them, and they can support almost infinite amounts of data because they're not trying to load all in memory. The other type of model that you can do in analysis services is called the tabular model. If you use Power BI, you already are using the tabular model. You may not be using analysis services, but originally when you wanted to create tabular models, especially with Excel, and that's when I first started using it, I created multi-dimensional, but you could create tabular models, and then Excel could connect with Power Pivot and slice and dice and do all that good stuff. You can today on premises create tabular or multi-dimensional, and Power BI can use those. So it's pretty cool. It's great. Built in. So these are all part of what you get when you buy SQL Server Enterprise Edition, at least. And finally, the newest edition, hence the little baby icon, is something called Machine Learning Services, or Server. This, I'm going to go my Wayback Machine because I have to explain how this evolved. R became super popular in machine learning about 6 years ago, or I should say 5 or 6 years ago. Microsoft wanted to support machine learning within the SQL Server database. They didn't have a product, so they bought a company called Revolution Analytics that had a product called R Server. R Server is very much like SQL Server, but it uses the R language. And what you essentially do for R Server is you send an R script in, and the R Server will run the script and do what it needs to do. Unlike open source R Server would maximize, could use many core, could use tons of memory, and could page things in and out to scale up as really well. Now R, if you've used it, doesn't do that. It won't use many core, it uses one. It will run out of memory and crash. And so it really was a problem. It would only do very small scale. Machine Learning Server will scale to the same level that SQL Server roughly, which means you have kind of a middle tier. It will scale at hundreds of millions of rows, just as SQL Server will, in terabytes, but probably not petabytes as something like Spark. But here's the best part of machine learning services or machine learning server is that you don't have to move data out of your database. And that's a huge advantage from a security standpoint, because one of the things I worry about is you're extracting customer records and IDs and names and addresses and possibly social security numbers or whatever, and you're pulling it out of the database. Where's it going? Where are you storing that? Are you protecting it? Now, DBAs can protect and lock down a database, but if you're going to extract data and put it somewhere else, how do they control that? How do they protect it? With machine learning services, you keep it in the database. You don't have to pull it out. Not to mention that's a huge performance improvement because you're leaving it in the database, and you can still use T-SQL back and forth, co-implemented with R and Python, because now it supports Python as well. So you can set up your machine learning training and execution in stored procedures, running the database with all the security. You can use T-SQL to do a lot of your data engineering, so it scales really well in the server. And then you can use R or Python to do the model training and things like that. And you can make your stored procedures callable, as you can any stored procedure, from outside the database. But again, you have all the security that you have in SQL Server, so it's no different than any other stored procedures. And another really big plus is DBAs can understand that, right? It's all within the database. It's not much different than the CLR. In fact, that's what they use to implement it. So it's not, rocket science. They can secure the store procedures. They can secure the data, and it's a huge relief to security and database people, DBAs. So it's a great solution, and it's one of my favorite things, actually. I was really excited. I've done presentations on this. Unfortunately, it's not as well known as it should be. I think Microsoft is really underrepresenting this awesome service, and it's tremendous. So these are the different areas you have. The fact that you have all these services is the big challenge to migrating workloads to Azure. And I'll tell you why. Microsoft did not implement, when you think of Azure Managed Instance or SQL DB, it only supports database services, and not all of them even there. So let me walk through this, because it takes a bit. If you have integration services, if you use ETL, most places do, again, more on the BI side. There is no SSIS in Azure. The closest thing is something called Azure Data Factory, which is a completely different architecture and a complete different modality, different way to work with it. It's a GUI based in Azure, etc. However, you can, as of a few years ago, you can migrate SSIS packages into Azure Data Factory and run them there. There's probably some tweaking you need to do, definitely connections, etc. But you can lift and shift SSIS packages. You have to create something called an integrated runtime, and you'll create an Azure SQL database behind the scenes so that it can store the SSIS catalog. But you can do it. So you do have an option, and so you could migrate to something like Azure SQL Managed Instance, and to move your integration services work, you can move the packages and deploy them into Azure Data Factory. And I may do a video on that because it is pretty cool. All right, so that is, you can handle that. But again, it's kind of a pain mentally, because you have to say, okay, I can't just move it into a SQL Server and I'm done. You got to handle that separately. Reporting services is an interesting one. Microsoft has moved so fast and so furiously with Power BI, so many features, so much stuff, that SSRS is all but forgotten. And Power BI is great, and it does a lot, and they did add support because they want you to move off of premises into Azure, so they do support now pixel perfect reporting within Power BI. But I don't believe that's going to be a trivial move, because obviously you have to think about security. You've got to take your reports and move them into Power BI service in Azure, and so you've got a lot of things to think about here. So you can do it. You'll have to play with it and evaluate those reports and how much you need them. So again, OLTP, all you really have to worry about is the database services usually, but for BI workloads, you've got these other things to think about. Now, analysis services. Here's an interesting thing. You have almost a perfect lift and shift for anything you have in analysis services on premises for the tabular model. You can move it right into analysis services in Azure. Azure Analysis Services, I have a video on it. It's awesome. I like to do more of them. I'm a huge fan of it, because it does something that's not easy to do on premises. You can actually scale up to multiple servers supporting your queries in Power BI. So you get really good scale and resiliency, etc. And I personally love the separation of the services. I know Power BI Premium is integrating it, but I like the separation myself. And you can control the database. Maybe it's because I do have a lot of T-SQL background. But anyway, you can lift it. However, if you have multi-dimensional models, which are not promoted, pushed anymore, and generally not the thing you want to use unless you have to, because the tabular model is all in memory, so it's click speed response, really fast. That is not supported in Azure Analysis Services. You're out of luck. So I don't know what you do with those. And the problem I see is if you said we're going to lift and shift and take our our BI workload and move it into Azure, do you want to run a SQL Server and pay the license just to run an old multi-dimensional model maintenance? I don't know. So you kind of lose some things if you have to do that. So that's a bit of a showstopper. And I don't know, and I could be wrong. I'm going to look. I don't think they have support yet for the multi-dimensional models in Azure Analysis Services. They have talked about it. If they do add it, then that becomes a roadblock removed from moving workloads, at least for the BI stack. Now, machine learning server, there is no option for that. There is no solution, I'm sorry to say, other than a VM. There is something called Azure ML. I've done a lot of videos on it. I'm very well versed with Azure ML. It's very cool and very powerful, but it's really different. It's meant to be a generic machine learning entire workflow system that does everything from soup to nuts. There is also something called a machine learning server you can create in HD Insight, but that's not integrated with a SQL Server database, right? So it's really kind of like Revolution Analytics used to sell their R server, only it will support Python as well. You can create that, and you can migrate workloads and things to it, but you're not getting the same thing because it's not integrated with your SQL Server, and it's a separate migration, and I don't really know what kind of rewriting might be involved. So that's something you would have to consider. Now let's talk about the most important thing when we talk about this, which is database services. Database services has things like T-SQL, SQL Agent, which is a job scheduler. Almost any place I've ever been uses SQL Agent, if nothing else, simply for maintenance, like backups, restores, etc. Link servers are a service which lets you connect to other types of data sources, including other SQL Server instances, but also Oracle, flat files, etc. So link servers are really powerful and really important in most environments, especially for BI. Integrated Active Directory, data encryption, there's a couple of different options there, and high availability. Azure SQL DB does not support SQL Agent. There's also something called Service Broker, not supported. There's also something called Database Mail, which is usually used to send emails saying a job is run or something, not supported in SQL DB. And probably the most important thing you do not get, and also link servers, but to me the most important thing you lose with Azure SQL DB, and this is a real showstopper, and that is you cannot do cross database joins in Azure SQL DB. So when you create an Azure SQL database, you kind of create that server level, and then you create a database under it, and you can create more databases, but one database query cannot cross join to another. That is something in the BI world ubiquitous. I never worked in an environment yet that didn't cross database join in the BI world because it's all under control. In the OLTP world, not so sure, but my guess is there are places where there's cross database joins. So it's something to consider, because usually people break out databases into subject areas or something, and it becomes an issue. So that's a real big problem with Azure SQL DB. In my opinion, very few existing workloads, especially I would say like OLTP workloads I mentioned, can be migrated to Azure SQL DB, which is probably why Azure SQL Managed Instance came along. The good news with Managed Instance is I would say many OLTP workloads could be migrated to Managed Instance because it has really good security, but it also supports almost all of the features in the database services engine DBAs know and love, including SQL Agent, link servers, all these other things. The high availability is actually kind of just integrated into the cloud. You don't need to set up multiple VMs and all that stuff you would do typically on premises. So you get a lot of great features, and you also get to take advantage of cloud services like analytics and monitoring and stuff like that. So you get a lot of good benefits, and you have a lot of flexibility in terms of scale. So what you don't get with Managed Instance is all of these other services. So I don't think managed instance is usually the right solution for a BI workload, but it could be. But when you're going to migrate a BI workload, you're going to have to think about these services and how they're used. When you're migrating an OLTP workload, you probably only have to worry about the database services. The other things are, except for maybe SSIS, you're probably not using most of the other services anyway. So you have a lot of options there. Now, if you can't migrate, then by all means you can move to Azure VMs, and there's marketplace selections you can make that have different versions of SQL Server, etc. The only problem there, of course, is you're going to have to maintain it yourself. If you want to upgrade, if you want to patch security, etc., it's up to you. And I don't want to completely downplay that, because there are a lot of nice features, Azure monitoring and resource limits and policies and things you can put around it. They do give you a lot of nice benefits, but I think the PaaS way, if you can do it, is the way to go. And over time, Microsoft is adding a lot of nice features to the PaaS solutions. So we talked about Azure SQL Database limitations, and we saw all that. Managed Instance has more features. So the Azure SQL Database, the one takeaway, I don't want to downplay it completely, because if you're looking to create a new application, I would totally look at it. It's inexpensive. It can be dirt cheap. It's also performs pretty well, and you have scale. You have options. You can do a lot of scale with it. Again, it is PaaS, so you get all this stuff. So if you're looking to build new stuff, or you have a fairly simple implementation on premises, then by all means look at Azure SQL DB. Managed Instance is a good option. Again, for new implementations, it's great. It's perfect. I would totally recommend it. If it's an existing migration, then again, do your evaluation. But there are limitations, so take a look at those. I showed you that link. Take a look at that as well. I think I showed you that link. Anyway, what you don't get with either one really is integration services, analysis services, or reporting services, or machine learning server. And you can't do, in Azure SQL DB, you cannot do cross joins. You don't get SQL agent, you don't get service broker. Now that last bullet point, you get all those things in managed instance, but you don't get the other services. Final review. We talked about IaaS, SaaS, and PaaS, and they're making up a whole bunch of new ones, but these are the three originals. I'll stand by them. Infrastructure as a service is essentially hardware in the cloud. Create your VMs and you're good to go. Software as a service is things like Office 365 and Power BI, and PaaS is what we really focused on here. That's what Azure SQL DB is, and that is what Azure SQL Managed Instance is. If you can't use the PaaS solution, your other option is to create a virtual machine to your liking under IaaS, which is a VM, right? The ways we can do SQL Server on Azure, I just said that, so I'll say it again, VMs or SQL DB or Managed Instance. We talked a lot about the limitations, so take a look at those, look around, make sure you have what you need. And that's it. I hope this is helpful. I know it took a little bit to get through all this. I was going to do something really quick, but there's just so many things to think about, and to leave something out would be a disjustice to what you need to know to properly make decisions around this. So please like, subscribe, and above all, share with other people. I hope this is helping people. I'd like to hear feedback from people, and I try to respond to every comment made and even answer questions. So thank you, and good day.